On the morning of the 1st of September 1715, Louis XIV passed away in his bedroom in the Château de Versailles, carried off in 23 days by a terrible disease, gangrene. The Sun King faced his death with the same panache he had shown throughout his entire reign.
Louis XIV, as the sovereign, had to perform a show of a good death, a great death that would serve as an example for all his subjects. All his life, he was wary of ensuring his reputation, having it acknowledged by his high deeds, by magnificent achievements. A good death was part of this prestigious policy, would be shown to all of Europe, and would enable him to leave a long-lasting mark in history.
Here was this monarch who was a type of ruling machine, who never let anything show, and even his death was part of his job, meaning that a king was born, lived, and died in public. So he had to work for his death to make it the final act in his king's role.
The sumptuous Versailles Palace, which Louis XIV had created entirely, turned out to be the ideal location to perform this final tragedy. But it was in the chateau at Marly, where he had taken up his summer residency for 2 months, where he enjoyed a relaxed lifestyle far from Versailles' protocol, that his decline began.
The court had settled in Marly like every summer since the 12th of June. The king's health was declining a little. He had some dizzy spells, but he wasn't more concerned than that. On the 10th of August, he felt a pain in his left leg.
He went back to Versailles, carried on living casually, even went for a stroll the next day in the Trianon Gardens, pursued his sovereign's life, went to chapel for Mass, held council, had his meals in public. He didn't eat much, but maintained the ritual of meals. Still went to his wife, Madame de Maintenon's, to listen to music. Everything went on as usual. This was Versailles.
The 10th of August is the symbolic date of the king's last illness, and also the beginning of the end, in a way. From the 10th of August onwards, there was a type of countdown. People followed hour by hour, and sometimes minute by minute, the king's agony until his last breath.
Louis XIV's intimate circle bared witness in the writing of all the stages of his demise. Their tales travelled through centuries. Noteworthy are the Marquis de Danjou's memoirs, a loyal and close friend of the royal couple, or the letters of the Princess Palatine, Louis XIV's sister-in-law, whose humour and frankness the king appreciated. An unavoidable feminine character of the court, she held an abundant correspondence with over 60,000 letters in which she related life at Versailles. As for Madame de Maintenon, whom the king secretly married in his second wedding, she shared the last 30 years of his life until the king's last breath. In her letters, she shared more intimate confidences on Louis's feelings, the man hidden behind the king's clothes. At the beginning of his illness, Louis XIV was about to celebrate his 77th birthday, a record for the time. However, he was not in high spirits.
In 1715, Versailles court was aging. Many old courtiers there who knew the king when he was young had remained loyal.
Versailles was synonymous of boredom. It was no longer synonymous of creativity and intellectual daring. Things were happening in Paris now.
This more austere atmosphere of the end of the reign was mostly due to the king's aging. He was less inclined to taste the entertainments that pleased the youth. He was with Madame de Maintenon, who was also rather aged, being 3 years older than him. So the aging couple tended to become withdrawn, especially since all the brilliant personalities of the era had disappeared.
He had lost all his greatest enemies, William of Orange, Leopold of Austria. He had no enemies left. He had outlived them. He had lost his greatest men, his generals, his artists, Colbert, Louvois, Mignard, Lebrun, Vauban. They had all disappeared. This was 1715. The 18th century had already begun. Everything was changing around the king. The Enlightenment was here. Louis XIV could not be a part of the new century. He stood like one last rampart.
Louis XIV ruled over France for 72 years, an endless reign, the longest in history, over all periods and countries. Even his people grew tired of this king who seemed immortal, who outlived his own descendants, literally decimated between 1711 and 1712.
First, it was Louis XIV's son, the heir apparent who died in 1711, then his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, then the latter's wife, the Duchess of Burgundy, and their child, Louis XIV's great-grandson, the eldest of the great-grandchildren, also died in 1712.
So who was left? The little Duke of Anjou, who was 2 years old, future Louis XV, the last grandson. And so it was on this young child of delicate health that the future of all the French monarchy depended. Louis XIV was very distressed by this series of deaths, but he carried on ruling the kingdom bravely. Yet, Madame de Maintenon wrote he sometimes came to her apartments alone. She said, "We shut the door. There was just the two of us, and he was overcome by uncontrollable tears."
This king was resigned, a king wounded by life and the tragedies that struck his family. Here was a king who was waiting to die.
Increasingly isolated, Louis XIV was a king hated by his people, tired of the endless military campaigns led since the beginning of his rule. Particularly the last one, the War of the Spanish Succession, whose 15 years of fighting had ruined the country.
France was going through a very difficult period. The royal treasure was depleted. This era was called the Little Ice Age. It was minus 20 degrees Celsius in Paris.
Winters were particularly harsh, and when we say harsh, memorialists say the wine froze in the carafes inside. They could not write because the inkwells froze.
Conditions were disastrous for the people. There was a famine with its lot of epidemics and riots. This was one more ordeal on top of the Spanish War. 1 million deaths. Over 5% of the population died.
France was exhausted. It was within this financial crisis and impopularity context that Louis XIV entered his twilight. During the weekend after he returned from Marly, he felt more pain in his left leg. On the morning of Monday, the 12th of August, his doctor examined him.
His chief doctor, Fagon, diagnosed him on Monday. It was a sciatica. Obviously, he was wrong, but he was adamant for over 12 days, which made him lose precious time.
Fagon was undoubtedly Louis XIV's great doctor. They were born the same year, in 1638, so the fact that the doctor and patient had the same age must have created a type of bond, complicity maybe, complementarity even. The king confided in him. He had the king's trust, and Fagon was extremely well respected at the court. Around the chief doctor, there were several dozen doctors, surgeons, and people who were connected to the maintenance, surveillance, and curing of the royal body.
There's a curious document entitled King Louis XIV's Health Journal. It's a daily diary of the king's health, written by his 3 chief doctors throughout his life. First, there was Vallot, during his childhood and the first part of his life. Then Daquin, and Fagon in the last part of his reign. In reading, one realizes that Louis XIV was truly Louis the Sickly. He had many illnesses throughout his life: fevers, migraines, renal colics, discomforts, vertigo. But these doctors were lucky to have an ideal patient with a robust constitution. He got over illnesses. Louis XIV was a force of nature.
Although his usual state was one of illness, his robust constitution helped him get over the worst ailments: bleedings as a baby, smallpox when he was 9, gonorrhea at 17, typhoid fever which nearly killed him and made him lose all his hair at the age of 22, measles at 24, a tapeworm at 32, giving him a terrific appetite. And at 47 years old, he underwent an operation so delicate and impressive that it was named the Great Operation.
Louis XIV's most famous disease, whose curing was the most celebrated, is the fistula he suffered from in 1686.
The king had an anal fistula. This is a type of small duct which was infected between his anus and his colon, and which was very painful.
Félix de Tassy, his chief surgeon, tried to reduce the abscess by all means, but an operation was inevitable.
It took place in Versailles in the king's bedroom, but in utmost secrecy. Certain patients of fistulas at the Versailles hospital were used as guinea pigs. The surgeon practiced on them.
Félix de Tassy created a scalpel with a type of flexible probe to avoid pain. A curved scalpel called à la royale. He introduced the probe and operated. The king underwent the operation without any anesthetics and with a high risk of infection. There was no antiseptic at the time. He dealt with the pain stoically and asked his surgeon to treat him like any other patient, so that his hand would not tremble. The operation was a great success. Louis XIV presided the council soon afterwards, and he rode his horse on March the 4th, which was a sign of complete recovery.
Despite the pain, Louis XIV continued to work with his ministers. He always gave priority to the kingdom, at the cost of his personal life. His last official appearance was the audience for the Persian ambassador, which he gave in public on the 13th of August.
Although he could barely stand up, he received him for hours, bound in an extremely heavy gold and black velvet costume, encrusted with diamonds. He had to take it off immediately after dinner. It tired him greatly, so they say. And then he ruled the council as if nothing had happened.
The reception took place in the Apollo Salon, Louis XIV's throne room, at the heart of the representation of royal power. On one of the walls is Louis XIV's most famous portrait, in his coronation costume painted by Rigaud in 1701. Ironically, the sovereign faced this painting once again, portraying him in all his majesty, with his slim, elegant left leg forward.
On this portrait, the king shows his leg. It was that very leg which was infected with gangrene, but the king was unaware of that at the time.
The illness evolved, and what everyone was most concerned about, especially his doctor, was that he didn't sleep anymore, and this meant that the pain never left him. On the 14th of August, the king was in so much pain that he was taken to Versailles' royal chapel in a chair for one last mass. Louis XIV used to go there every day at 10. This royal chapel that he saw for the last time on this day is his architectural testament. For him, it was the most important piece at the end of his reign. £2 million to build it. Can you imagine? It's quite considerable. It's 3 times the budget of the Hall of Mirrors, for instance. The royal chapel has 2 stories, like any Palatine chapel. But this one took on a dimension which was unheard of. On the ground floor was the court, and upstairs, on the same level as his apartments, was the king surrounded by his family.
In the next few days, the doctors found the king's leg had swollen and his fever increased. Despaired by this illness they could not control, they tried out various useless treatments, rubbing the leg with hot towels or plunging it in baths filled with aromatic herbs with Burgundy wine. A clear-sighted letter by Madame Palatine, the king's sister-in-law, expressed the concern which was suddenly spreading throughout the court.
The king's illness frightens me so that my heart trembles.
People started to have doubts about the king's health degradation, insofar as he could no longer walk or even stand up. People were used to moving Louis XIV about on a wheelchair when he had gout, but this time Louis XIV was much worse than when he had bouts of gout, and the symptoms were not similar to gouts.
On the 19th of August, he was bedridden and would not leave his room again. The illness was worse than he thought.
Everything concentrated in this royal bedroom, which became the center of the world, where the final act would unfold. Like an Act 5, Scene 5 of the great tragedies by Racine, where his death would unfold. It was both dramatic and spectacular, but also contained, serene, and full of devotion.
Everything was going to happen in this room at the heart of the Versailles Palace. He chose its position in 1701 on the great east-west perspective. The bedroom faces the east and faces the rising sun. He had chosen all the room's arrangements, and this was where he would die.
Louis XIV brought the court system to its perfection. The idea of radiating around the royal persona, meaning that everything revolved around the king, like the sun and its satellites. The image of the sun for King Louis XIV is perfectly well suited.
The sovereign had the full powers. Everyone gravitated around him. He was the master.
Etiquette under Louis XIV's rule was the most complex in Europe. It may make us smile today, all the little privileges, which Saint-Simon called the little politics of small nothings. Holding the candle when the king went to bed, holding his shirt by the right arm.
The favor the most sought after was to approach the king with as few witnesses as possible. It was called the brevet d'affaires, when the king was on his close stool. Being part of the king's entourage when he went hunting was also very much sought after.
Each small privilege set ranks, which marked the importance of courtiers amongst themselves. Louis XIV designed a fearsome system allowing him to hold court. And these courtiers, this nobility, instead of getting along together to protest against the king's power, they all had their eyes on the king and argued over privileges. A fine example of the maxim, divide and rule. Every space in Versailles was connected to this life on display. Everything was made for the king to be seen.
Courtiers who had a function at the king's house lived at Versailles. There were around 3,000 of them. But during the parties thrown by the king, all the nobility came from Paris and other regions. The crowd reached up to 10,000 people.
All the king's everyday life occurred in public, beginning with the levée ceremony, which took place in the king's bedroom. Later in the morning, there was Mass in the chapel. He could then be seen walking in his gardens, which were open to the public. Then there were the king's meals. Dinner at lunchtime and supper in the evening were also public. The day ended with the king's retiring ceremony. His whole life was in public. Etiquette was maintained until the end. Entrance into the bedroom was filtered. One only entered if one had been invited or if one had the privilege.
Louis XIV was on a theater stage during his last days. He was in his bed behind the balustrade, like in a play. And he died in front of the court. He created this court system of the king's absolute representation system for the best and worst moments. And Louis XIV never hid his weaknesses, but showed he resisted them, and that was even stronger.
On the 22nd of August, Fagon, fearing to be held sole responsible for his royal patient's decline, ordered 10 doctors from Paris to come and examine the king. They all came by order of years of experience. They were very eloquent to hide their helplessness and came up with ridiculous remedies like donkey's milk, more digestible than cow's milk for the sick.
In the 17th century, they still had very vague ideas of the cause of diseases. Medicine had not evolved since ancient times. They still believed in Hippocrates and the humor theory. And since they knew very little about what caused illnesses, there were 2 universal remedies: purging and bleeding.
They counted in poilettes, which were plates that would fill in blood, according to the need of the bleeding. 3, 4, 5 poilettes could amount to 10, 20, 30 centiliters of blood, and sometimes more, which for someone who was already ill and feverish could result in losing consciousness.
Louis XIV probably underwent several hundred bleedings. As for purging, the second medical treatment of the time, he endured it stoically until the beginning of his last illness. As Dangeau wrote in his journal in fashionable terms, the king takes medicine.
In the 17th century, when one used the expression to take medicine, it meant either taking a purge, meaning swallowing a liquid, a preparation that would make one vomit, or make you defecate, or it was an enema. In Louis XIV's case, for example, his chief doctor required the king to take medicine once a month, twice a month exceptionally, or once every 2 months. It was a real established ritual at the court, and parts of it were public.
I am convinced that if the king, who is only 77 years old, had not been purged so often in such an inhuman way by Fagon, he would have gone past his 80th birthday. But he purged him until he bled.
And the king suffered tremendously in those days. He said he had never felt such heightened pain, and the doctors never relieved him of that pain. On the 24th of August, the king's leg was bandaged, and his leg was found to be marbled in black. The diagnosis was obvious. It was gangrene.
The doctor's incompetence became evident. They were not able to identify the illness and would not be able to cure it.
When Louis XIV understood it was gangrene, he knew he was doomed.
To stop gangrene, an irreversible tissue necrosis, doctors performed amputations, a radical operation without any anesthetics or sterilization. Louis XIV was narrowly spared this ultimate torture.
Doctors and surgeons knew gangrene very well, but no one dared say the word, because they knew that at the time, gangrene practically meant death, and rare were old people who survived an amputation. The king's surgeons did consider amputation, especially Maréchal, the chief surgeon.
When Maréchal gave 10 lancet blows to the king's leg, he noticed that the gangrene had spread hugely to all the left side. Sources said that the king's leg was in the same state as if he had been dead 6 months.
The sovereign himself asked to be amputated, but his doctors were against it. It was too late. Realizing there was nothing left to do, doctors stopped all treatment.
In this very religious society, Louis XIV had to accomplish his Christian duty. Before dying, he devoted himself entirely to preparing his soul for God.
The last rites were given to the king on the 25th of August. On the previous day, he had learned his illness was fatal and asked Father Letellier for immediate confession. Then he received the last rites, which were the viaticum, communion, and extreme unction.
The king's faith was solidly anchored. It was personal, a faith that supported him and would support him naturally upon his death. He was even heard saying, "If this is dying, I am not afraid, and I would like to suffer more to expiate my sins." So it was an edifying death, both the death of a king and the death of a Christian.
Louis XIV was recognized as a very Christian king. During the coronation ceremony, he drew his powers straight from God. This was the divine right of kings. During the coronation, the body was divided in two. He had a sacred body. Throughout his life, it was his duty to be a very Christian and religious king. He answered only to God.
On the morning of the 26th of August, Louis XIV asked his surgeon how much time he had left to live. The surgeon answered 2 days. From this day on, he began bidding farewell to the various members of his entourage and family.
Louis XIV received the princes first and advised them to remain united. After this speech, he said these moving words, "I hope you will remember me sometimes." The princess's visit was one of the most painful moments for the king, who was extremely attached to his feminine galaxy. He could not resist his daughter and granddaughter's tears, nor those of the Princess Palatine.
Madame Palatine was the king's sister-in-law and thus was allowed into the king's bedroom for his farewell. She related the moment in the letter she wrote that very evening. She was astounded she did not lose consciousness, for she was so moved and upset by what she saw.
He wished me happiness and blessings, and to be happy all my life. I fell to my knees, took his hand and kissed it. He embraced me.
Then he bid farewell to Madame de Maintenon. He said something odd, which she did not answer to and was a little offended by. He told her the only consolation he had was that given her age, he would see her again in heaven soon. He also begged forgiveness for not having loved her enough or made her happy enough. He worried about her future and entrusted her to the care of the Duke of Orléans.
Then he addressed his successor, his great-grandson, who was 5 years old and who was brought to the bedroom by his governess, Madame de Ventadour. He was lying in bed. The child approached him and he gave him an extremely moving speech whose words were recorded by a witness, the Marquis de Dangeau. This is the famous speech that begins with, "Mignon, you are going to be a great king."
Mignon, you will be king of a great kingdom. I urge you never to forget your obligations to God. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. I have loved war too much. Do not copy me in that or in my overspending. Lighten your people's burden as soon as possible and do what I have had the misfortune not to do myself.
He finished his speech giving him his blessing and burst into tears, moved by what he was doing.
Here was Louis XIV at the head of such a numerous family that succession problems were inconceivable. But in 1715, Louis XIV's only successor was Louis XV, a 5-year-old boy, the king's great-grandson. This meant that the 2 generations between Louis XIV and Louis XV had been decimated, which was unthinkable 15 years beforehand.
Alarmed by his dynasty's frailty, the king had written his will 1 year before his death. He had planned a regency until Louis XV's coming of age. He had to be 13 to rule according to monarchy's usages. He named his little appreciated nephew the Duke of Orléans not the regent, but the head of the Regency Council.
Louis XIV had prepared a spectacular turn of events by removing the Duke of Orléans from the regency. He did not completely ban him because the Duke of Orléans had to exert the regency. It was in the crown's order of succession. It was more subtle than that. He deprived him of any power by making him the president of the Regency Council. And this council was composed of 13 people, including the Duke of Orléans. The other 12 were the Duke of Orléans' 12 enemies, like the legitimized sons, the Duke of Maine and the Duke of Toulouse.
Louis XIV had done something unthinkable by raising the Duke of Maine and the Duke of Toulouse, his illegitimate sons born from his affair with Madame de Montespan, to the rank of princes of the blood. His bastards could claim to succeed him in the same way as his legitimate heirs could. This decision, which violated the kingdom's fundamental laws, caused a scandal among nobility. In his will, Louis XIV favoured the Duke of Maine, his favourite.
The Duke of Maine received the heir's apparent superintendency in his education, and above all he got the mastery of the military household of the king. So he disposed of the heir apparent's force and education. Orléans was left on the sidelines.
Louis XIV was no dupe when he wrote his will. He was lucid and knew that as soon as he would die, the will would be broken. And he said so in his memoirs. We can do anything we want when we are alive, but when we aren't, we can do less than an individual.
The king was gradually losing consciousness, but they still tried one last thing, notably with the arrival of a certain Brun, who was a type of charlatan.
He spoke to the Duke of Orléans and said he had a cure for all gangrenes, outer, inner, and blood infections.
This cure was drops that were mixed in with Burgundy wine, which was the wine Louis XIV drank.
There was no hope left, so people agreed that the king take this treatment.
The king almost lived again. People shouted, "It's a miracle." There was movement in the court. Many people had gathered in the antechambers of the Duke of Orléans, who was getting ready to rule. Chambers emptied, people rushed back to the king. This did not last, because the elixir had a limited time effect.
One can believe that taking alcohol did provide some respite, but the interval only lasted 24 hours. And then Louis XIV was even worse. Brun fled, thinking that he could be held responsible for the king's imminent death.
And rather quickly, the king fell in a semi-conscious state. From then on, people waited for his death, which occurred on the morning of the 1st of September.
Sunday, September 1st, 1715. The king died this morning at 8:15 and a half. He yielded up his soul without any effort, like a candle going out.
When the king expired, the Duke of Orléans immediately went to pay homage to the young Duke of Anjou. He knelt before him without saying a word. The child understood by this gesture that he was the new king, that his great-grandfather had died, and he burst into tears.
He died surrounded by the faculty. He was not alone. There were also clergymen who prayed continuously. There was also all his service, certain princes of his family, and he died on show, like he lived most of his life.
As soon as his death was announced, clergymen left the bedroom. The king's eyes were closed, his hands were placed on his stomach, and the bedroom was prepared for the day's visits. The rule was to present the deceased, showing his face, during one day in the bed he died in, displayed for whoever wanted to see him. It was a public display without any order, hierarchy, pomp, or anything. It was just to show that he was dead.
Louis XIV's death certificate was recorded by the priest Huchon in Notre-Dame de Versailles' register. The king slipped in between Louise Boulogne and Elizabeth Prudence Berger, two young girls who died in infancy. As soon as he disappeared, the Sun King became a mere individual, like any other. His authority was swept away because when he passed, his last wishes were trampled.
The very day of Louis XIV's death, on the 1st of September, when the will was still secret, the Duke of Orléans was informed that he would be removed from regency. And extremely quickly, he organized for the following day, the 2nd, a solemn séance at Parliament, and there he played his part. He entered the Parliament, reminded them of the last words Louis XIV had told him, that he would keep all the rights his rank entitled him to. The will was opened, and then they learned that he was removed from regency. He pretended to be offended, to not understand. And finally, with a few arguments, in one afternoon, he turned all the members of Parliament around.
Nothing could have been easier. He promised them the earth and the Parliament like one man, entrusted all the regency to Philippe of Orléans, and that was that.
From then on the evening of the 2nd of September, it was settled. 2 weeks later, there was a parliament session with a lit de justice. A lit de justice is a session in the Parliament of Paris in the presence of the king. On the 12th of September, it was in 5-year-old Louis XV's presence that the full powers were officially given to the Duke of Orléans, who was recognized as regent.
In parallel of this political upheaval, to annul the will, the royal funeral ritual began in Versailles. Louis XIV had not left any instructions, so the Duke of Orléans ordered the same celebrations as Louis XIII had had.
On the 2nd of September, it was the autopsy day. The king's body was moved from his bedroom to the bull's-eye salon, where a large table had been placed with a tablecloth on it. The king's body was placed on the table, where he would be autopsied.
There were about 30 people around this long table, upon which the king's corpse was laid. It must have been in a state of advanced decomposition and unbearable stench.
During Louis XIV's autopsy, they noticed that the gangrene had continued to spread, so they were sure it was gangrene, which would be qualified as senile nowadays. It spread from the left foot and went up the entire body to reach the head.
It was during this autopsy that the king's corpse was separated in a symbolic way into 3 separate parts: the body, the entrails, and the heart.
This ternary fission was an old tradition of French monarchy, which meant that sovereigns would honor 3 different places through their remains. The king has 3 tombs, one for his body in Saint-Denis, the royal necropolis, the heart tomb in Saint-Louis des Jésuites Church, Rue Saint-Antoine, and the entrails tomb at Notre-Dame in Paris. Once the autopsy was finished, the king's body was embalmed and the entrails were replaced with all sorts of traditionally preserving plants, and also with tow, which was a kind of fabric that gave a shape to the king's body.
Louis XIV's body was too damaged to be displayed, even embalmed. So the body was embalmed because it was tradition, but it was immediately placed in his coffin.
And he was put in a double coffin of oak and lead, and then the king's body disappeared for good.
It was the first time things happened like this, because in former times, and until Henry IV, there was a wax effigy reproducing the sovereign's traits in a very realistic way. And this effigy was entitled to all the honors the king had when he was alive. He was even served meals. Louis XIII stopped this custom, judging it was too pagan. He decided there would no longer be effigies.
When the king was in his coffin, he was no longer displayed in his funeral room, but would be presented in Mercury's drawing room, which was the king's former parade room and would now serve as funerary parlor.
The king's body was moved in 3 pieces on a podium, on which a golden sheet was laid, and then the coffin was placed on it. On the coffin, the heart was laid, and at the foot of the coffin, the entrails. Then, for a week, the bodies of the state, ambassadors, clergymen who came to sprinkle holy water would parade in a strict protocol. This was a real show that went on for 8 days.
On 9 September, at the end of the day, at 7 in the evening, the coffin was brought down into the royal courtyard at the Château of Versailles, where a great funeral carriage awaited. One must imagine hundreds of people escorting him, with guards, of course, a crowd of poor people dressed in grey and holding a candle, and all his officers, chaplains, a series of carriages with princes who accompanied the king. Then the procession left Versailles via the Avenue de Paris, went down to the Pont de Sèvres, crossed the Seine, and went along the Bois de Boulogne to reach Saint-Ouen and finally Saint-Denis.
Parisians came out to see this extraordinary show go by, with 2,500 people with the royal guard, drums rolling, torches held high. Since the procession lasted a long time, they had set up tents, had brought food and drinks, and were not necessarily in a great contemplative mood.
The Parisians feasted, and some even made nasty comments. A tenacious legend holds that Louis XIV was transported on the sly, but it was traditional to deliver great personalities at night. The important royal procession reached Saint-Denis in the early hours of the morning, where the clergy took the king's body in hand.
This, of course, is symbolic, leaving Versailles at night and arriving in the morning in Saint-Denis, going from death at night to resurrection in the light.
The king's body was displayed for a few days in the basilica, then moved to the sanctuary for 42 days, the time required to prepare the sumptuous settings for the ceremony.
To hold all the public that would come for the ceremony in Saint-Denis, they had to transform it into a theater or even an opera hall. They built loggias. The entire church was draped in black. Windows were blacked out. It was all black inside, and thousands of candles lit it up. And in the middle of all this, a gigantic catafalque inside which the coffin was placed.
We have a vision of this Gothic church which was entirely transformed. They were in a baroque space, all the way up to the top.
The service in charge of organizing the king's funeral was this legendary service called Les Menus Plaisirs. And these Menus Plaisirs, whose exact title was Argenterie, Menus Plaisirs et Affaires de la Chambre, were in charge of all ephemeral entertainments at the court. These could be parties, or the king's coronation, parties thrown in the gardens, but also funerals. And in Saint-Denis, it was the Menus Plaisirs who were in charge of designing this huge funeral decoration, which was thought of as a theatrical decoration. And people admired it like they would admire a theatrical display.
One could see a procession of people who wanted to be seen, because this was the place to be seen in, and show one's real situation at court. Which clothes to wear, what place to have, who could one pass, who could be overtaken. It was a fundamental aspect of such a long funeral for the court society.
On the 23rd of October, after a 5-hour-long mass celebrated in his memory, Louis XIV could finally rest forever. But his coffin did not join those of the rest of his family. He would replace Louis XIII in the antechamber stored in a crypt reserved for the body of the last dead king.
He was lowered to the entrance of the vault at the foot of the steps, with his head turned towards the entrance of the vault, as if he was waiting for his successor. When his successor would die, his body would be transported to the back of the vault with the others, and the coffin of his successor would take his place. And before closing it, there was a famous ceremony where the various monarchy insignia were laid on the coffin, such as the gauntlet, the shield, the helmet, the spurs, the sword, the banner of France, the pennon, the king's own banner.
And then the King of Arms shouted out the famous, "King Louis XIV is dead, long live King Louis XV," which became, "The king is dead, long live the king." And everybody shouted, "Long live the king," 3 times.
The music started to play, drums to roll, trumpets rang out, and everyone shouted, "Long live the king." So it was a funeral ceremony, the king is dead, but it was also a ceremony of accession, long live the king.
In Paris, more such spectacular services were given in the following weeks at Notre Dame or the Sainte-Chapelle. For 1 year, royal funerals were organized all over the Kingdom of France, in the neighboring countries in Europe, in Rome, or in Spain, and even the rest of the world, in Mexico or Peru, to pay one last homage to the Sun King. His remains still rest in Saint-Denis, thanks to Louis XVIII, the last French king buried there who restored the royal necropolis 25 years after its desecration. The bones of Louis XIV were retrieved haphazardly in the mass graves with those of Louis XIII, Henry IV, Marie de Médicis, and many others, and gathered in the same ossuary behind these walls. And in the Prince's Chapel, which comprises the coffins of Adélaïde and Victoire de France, Louis XV's daughters, the princes of Condé, the Duke of Berry, and his granddaughter Isabelle d'Artois, who died at 1 day old, Louis XIV's heart joined as he desired his father Louis XIII's in the middle of the heart cabinet. Upon this vermeil box, the following epitaph is engraved.
Here is the heart of Louis XIV. By the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, very Christian, deceased in his palace in Versailles on the 1st day of September, 1715. Requiescat in pace.